Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and welcome to a special edition of The Heat. As the United Nations marks its 80th anniversary, we look at the cornerstone of its charter, peace and security. The UN has often been called upon to prevent disputes from escalating into war or to help restore peace following the outbreak of armed conflict. Joining me now is the UN's Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Now, right now, the world is facing prolonged conflicts, including the one in Gaza, which a UN panel has declared a genocide, the other conflict, the major one, being Ukraine. What do you see as the potential consequences if these conflicts continue? And how can the UN further advance the resolution of these conflicts?
Well, obviously, we're facing a situation where there has never been so many conflicts around the world. You mentioned Gaza, Ukraine, but you could add Sudan, the Libya, the DR Congo, and so many other conflict situations. I believe that the only way to properly address these conflicts and ultimately reach political solution is a collective approach. You know, the UN stands for collective and multilateral responses to crisis. So in a way, it is important that we were having so many leaders, world leaders gathering here in New York for the week and having so many meetings and interaction. But what we need is for our member states to overcome their division and join forces to support political solutions that can be only achieved through collective action. So I know it's aspirational, but at the same time, it's what the UN stands for. And the UN can only achieve those goals if we have a more united membership, a more united international community able to overcome its polarization and, again, work collectively to address crisis.
The United Nations mission in Lebanon was established in the 1970s to maintain stability in the country, with the Lebanese armed forces now playing a bigger role in maintaining peace, and with the UN expressing optimism about peace in the country. How do you see the prospects for a lasting peace in Lebanon?
Well, the objective is to achieve stability in Lebanon and in the region through the full implementation of the political framework for a solution, which is the Resolution 1701 of the UN Security Council. Resolution 1701 is about reaching a point or a situation where the Lebanese authorities, the Lebanese government, will be in full control of the Lebanese territory and in full control of the weapons in Lebanon. The Lebanese government has displayed a very strong political will to work towards that objective, and the UN's role and the UN's mission is really about supporting the Lebanese authorities in those endeavors. Our force, UNIFIL, is deployed on the ground. Its mandate has been extended by the Security Council until the end of 2026, and we intend to make the best of these 16 months to actively support the Lebanese authorities and the Lebanese armed forces in their efforts.
You have been head of UN peacekeeping since 2017. How has the nature of peacekeeping changed or evolved, and what do you see as the key challenges?
Right. Well, I would say that the nature of peacekeeping is fundamentally political. People think about UN peacekeeping, and often they think about uniformed personnel with blue helmets or blue beret, and obviously these uniformed personnel are very important. But at the same time, the raison d'être for peacekeeping is supporting political efforts. Now, what has changed is the political and security environment of peacekeeping. So essentially, we have seen a deterioration both of the political environment as well as security environment, more division, more polarization across the UN membership, but also an evolving set of threats, particularly with the key drivers of conflict, such as transnational criminal activities, the impact of climate change, global terrorism, but also the negative impact of digital technology, which are enabling greater threats to both the peacekeepers as well as the population that they're protecting.
Now, UN peacekeeping operations abide by certain principles, the principle of neutrality, for instance, the consent of the parties, as well as no use of force unless that force is being used in self-defense. How would you assess the importance of these principles?
Well, I think these principles are absolutely valid. Obviously, we cannot operate without the consent of the parties, the consent of the host government or the consent of the parties to a conflict. And indeed, the raison d'etre of peacekeeping is to support the implementation of a peace agreement, or at least a ceasefire between conflicting parties. Neutrality, obviously, is a duty and impartiality. And as far as non-use of force, unless in self-defense or in defense of the mandate, which I believe is an important dimension, is also critical. And I believe that, on one hand, that allows for UN peacekeeping to act robustly and decisively, particularly when it comes to protecting civilians, obviously protecting the peacekeepers as well. On the other hand, peacekeeping is not peace enforcement. And when peace enforcement is required in a given situation, then others should do this. Others should deploy peace enforcement operations. Those operations need to be better supported, particularly African peace enforcement operation. But I think there has to be, and there continues to be, a very clear distinction between peacekeeping and peace enforcement.
What about peacekeeper training? What kind of progress have you seen? And what kind of contribution has a country like China made? Of course, China is deeply involved in peacekeeping operations around the world.
Training is absolutely critical. And training is constantly evolving because the environment, as I was saying, is constantly evolving. So we need to add more training on things such as digital technology, counter IED, counter drones, lots of other things that are, increasingly important in peacekeeping. And this is why the role of member states, and particularly those with important capacities such as China, is absolutely vital. I mean, I have myself visited the training center, both the People's Liberation Army peacekeeping training center, as well as the Chinese police training center. I have seen a number of modules and a number of Chinese, but also international peacekeepers benefiting from training provided by these institutions in China. This is absolutely vital, and I believe that we will continue to need the support of China and other member states with significant capacities to meet the needs that we have in terms of training.
The United Nations is now commemorating its 80th anniversary, the 80th anniversary of its founding. But this comes at a time when there's vigorous debate within the organization and outside about reform, especially reform of the Security Council. There's also tightening budgets that you are facing. There's also non-payment of dues by some countries. How do all of these impact peacekeeping operations?
Well, obviously, there is a need for adaptation and reform, and that is the purpose of the Secretary General's UNAT initiative, which is about eliciting more efficiencies and more, frankly, more coherence across the UN system. On the other hand, when it comes to the question of finances and contribution, what we really expect from member states is consistency. Because on the one hand, the mandate of peacekeeping operation is decided by member states, through the Security Council in particular. And therefore, since member states are deciding and really creating and extending mandates of peacekeeping operation, what we expect from them is consistency in terms of them also paying their contribution to peacekeeping. Now, reform is obviously very important, and it is important at different levels. You mentioned reforming the Security Council. I believe that our Secretary General has quite often stated the importance of such reform, but obviously it's for member states to decide on that and to decide on the modalities of such reform. But you have heard, I believe, our Secretary General quite often stating the importance of adapting multilateralism to today's global realities.
So those are some of the major challenges. But looking back on 80 years of the United Nations, what do you see as some of its major accomplishments?
Well, I think that it's clear that the list of countries that have been successfully supported by peacekeeping operation in achieving stability is quite long. You could mention Timor-Leste in Asia or Cambodia. In Africa, you have Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia. Many El Salvador in Latin America, and I could mention many more countries. So it's a long list of achievement, which I believe resulted from the support that was provided by peacekeeping operation, but also the implementation of peace agreement in those countries. And implementing peace agreements requires not only the active involvement and positive involvement of the parties to these agreements, but it also involves and implies a strong, united support from the international community as a whole. And I'm saying this because today, with the divided international community, achieving political solutions is much more difficult. And I believe that this is probably our #1 challenge also to peacekeeping, because peacekeeping is created and exists to support the achievement of political solutions.
Now, as I said earlier on, China plays an important and big role in peacekeeping operations. How would you assess the Chinese role?
Chinese role is very critical and very important in many ways. I believe that, first of all, the political support that is extended by China to peacekeeping is always been very strong. And I have seen that again very recently when I was in China last week. So the political support is critical. But in addition to that, China provides UN peacekeeping with very effective and professional peacekeepers. It's one of the most important troop and police contributing countries to peacekeeping, with more than 1,800 peacekeepers deployed in many missions. And then you have a role of China as an important financial contributor, the second largest contributor to financial contributor to peacekeeping. And finally, you mentioned training and capacity building, which I believe is also very critical. Capacity building and training, not only to Chinese peacekeepers, but also to many peacekeepers from other countries. And I think that is really a very important contribution that China is making to enhancing the effectiveness of peacekeeping.
The CGTN documentary, Blue Helmets, No Borders, highlights the courage and sacrifices of United Nations peacekeepers. How important is it for such stories to be told globally, and how can they strengthen your operations?
I think communicating on the achievement of our peacekeepers, their dedication, their commitment, the commitment, dedication of Chinese peacekeepers, the service that they provide to communities at risk, to building peace, to preserving ceasefire, that is absolutely essential. And I believe that we never do enough of that. You know, we need to convey the positive stories about, you know, what peacekeepers, what difference is being made by our peacekeepers every single day. Every single day they protect hundreds of thousands of civilians, they protect ceasefire, they support state building, capacity building, and all of this, I believe, needs to be told and needs to be conveyed to the public at large.
Thank you for joining us, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
As a founding member of the United Nations, China has consistently championed multilateralism, dialogue and conflict resolution, from contributing the largest number of peacekeepers among the permanent members of the Security Council to advocating diplomatic solutions in hotspots from Africa to the Middle East. Beijing has led the way in collective security. Joining us now is Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He is an Africa security and policy analyst, and Andy Mock is a senior research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Andy Mock, China, as I mentioned, is the largest contributor of peacekeepers among the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. It is also the second largest contributor to the peacekeeping budget. Talk to us about why China attaches such importance to the UN's peacekeeping mandate.
Well, Anand, I think there's two reasons for this. So one is historical, and one is based on China's understanding and vision for a more peaceful world. So if we go back to the founding of the United Nations, China was present at the creation as one of the countries that bore the biggest price and I think fought the hardest to overcome fascism. And I think since then, I think China has been a staunch believer in the international system and maintaining a system that can deliver a more equitable world for every country in it. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think the second then is the understanding that these complex solutions, conflicts around the world, really do require a multilateral approach to solve. And then the United Nations is the best platform for doing so, despite some structural challenges and other issues that I'm sure we'll touch on in this discussion.
Abdullahi, the United Nations supports peace and security in Africa through a number of peacekeeping operations, which include operations in the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Western Sahara, and the Abyei area. How effective are current and past UN peacekeeping missions in Africa in protecting civilians as well as stabilizing regions?
Thank you so much, Aidna. I think the UN is critical in peace and security on the continent. Like you mentioned, some of the major peacekeeping operations are on the continent. But the challenge is really to prove the counterfactual. There are some places, for instance, the Central African Republic, without the peacekeeping operation, that country would really struggle. If you look at the eastern part of the DRC, where the UN has the largest and potentially the oldest peacekeeping operation, that peacekeeping operation has not been effective. And also, I might add that peacekeeping operation as part of a multilateral engagement is as good as the member countries want it to be effective. So I think there are areas that the UN does very well, and there are areas that the UN really needs to improve. However, it's been 80 years, and the people who really used to champion the UN and the multilateral institution that undergirds the UN are moving away ever so every single day. So the UN is at a crossroad, and that might have implications not just for Africa peace and security, but for the world.
Andy Mark, China's peacekeepers continue to serve in parts of Africa, in the Middle East, and beyond. How does Beijing's increasing role in peacekeeping efforts around the world fit in with its broader foreign policy goals and, of course, as you pointed out a moment ago, its pursuit of a multipolar world?
Well, Anand, I think first of all, I want to add a little bit to what the previous guests just said, because there is a lot of talk that the UN has, quote unquote, failed in its mission. And I think first we have to recognize that it is a very challenging set of circumstances, these different conflicts around the world that have very complex causes. But I think there's also a misperception as to what the UN was founded to achieve at the end of World War II. And the most important objective was to prevent another world war. And the UN has succeeded in that. Now, not entirely because of its own actions, but I think to a large degree because of the nuclear balance of terror that made conflict, a worldwide conflict, unthinkable. So within that context, I think we can see that the UN was designed for a certain thing, achieved that purpose. And also, there's the question that the UN was never meant to be a global policeman or a world government, and that it is constrained by exactly as the guest said, by the resources and the commitment of its member nations. So I think given that, the UN has succeeded, I think, in many key ways. Now, can it do better? Of course. And I think this is, again, where China's leadership is playing a role in both reform as well as, I think, some of the structural changes in addressing the current challenges around the world that are not just conflicts in Africa, but in Ukraine, in the Middle East, climate change, cybersecurity, other global challenges that require a multilateral response. And I think one of the points you raised, Anand, is that we are in a world that is more and more multipolar. And I think that makes an organization like the UN even more vital. And I think this, again, is why China has prioritized this as an institutionalist, working within structures like the United Nations versus taking a more revolutionary approach, saying, we need to build something completely new.
Abdullahi, among the underlying causes of insecurity and conflict on the continent of Africa, we see things like the lasting effects of colonialism, weak governance, as well as inequality. How can the United Nations, together with other organizations like the African Union, with regional organizations, get together to address these underlying causes?
Thank you, Adnan. I think the previous speaker made it very clear that we are living in a multipolar world. The role of the UN needs to be redefined, and some of it is ongoing. And the role of other institutions on the continent, not least the African Union and the regional bodies like IGAD, East African Community, and ECOWAS, and South African Development Corporation, that is SADC, they need to change. And the fundamental really here is, if you look at the age profile of many of the African continent, that is its population, they're young, they're more aspirational. Without reforming the politics and not just remaining at the political level, but also the economy, giving a lot of people, young people who are coming out of schools, jobs, you will not be able to reform you can have your elections free and fair, but if people do not have food, adequate water, piped water that is, and electricity, it will be very difficult. So I think the process of rebuilding the African states' capacity, that is not outsourcing some of these things to the UN, where the UN can provide the best practices, can offer some of the expertise on the best international normative standards around socioeconomic as well as environmental standards, would be very important. But I think that role, that function primarily stays with the African governments and institutions. And in China, they have a model that has worked. 30 years ago, China was not very far from where, let's say, countries like South Africa or Nigeria or Egypt or Ethiopia are. And they need to learn some of those lessons in a mutual way rather than it being forced down the throat, like structural adjustment programs that we are paying the cost even to date around education, around health, around public investment in some of the public goods that really takes countries forward.
Andy, Mark, as I said at the beginning of our interview, China has played an increasingly active role in UN peacekeeping operations. But how has that role changed since the 1990s?
Well, Anand, I think, as China's economy has grown, as it's moved increasingly closer to the center of the global stage, I think it's not surprising, again, given China's philosophy, vision, strategy for engagement with the broader world, that its peacekeeping role has increased as well. But I also want to add that there's another aspect to the United Nations where China has also played a very central role that I think doesn't get the attention it deserves. And that is that the UN has played a pivotal role in the hidden plumbing of globalization. So whether we're looking at standardized passports, air safety rules, maritime codes, communication networks, weather, that the UN, without the coordination of the UN, a lot of what makes this modern world possible, even in an age of multipolarity, would not really be possible. So I think China recognizes this, that at the same time, there must be overt measures like peacekeeping, but at the same time, the infrastructure of globalization also needs to be tended to and advanced. And maybe this becomes even more important in a world where cybersecurity is more and more of a priority. AI, synthetic biology, genetic engineering, et cetera. These are all both immense opportunities, but also threats that can affect the entire world. So I think, when I see China's role at the UN, certainly peacekeeping is very important, but this hidden plumbing of globalization is also very important as well. And I think it's very clear China also emphasizes the importance of this as well.
Abdullahi, the continent of Africa also faces significant climate security challenges. We look at droughts, we look at flooding, we look at climate migration as we see it, food insecurity, water issues as well. That in turn has led to displacement of people, it's led to migration, it's led to conflict in many instances. How can climate security be better integrated into what the UN is doing to resolve conflicts in Africa and to stabilize regions?
I think I'll pick it up from where my colleague has said the soft role that the UN plays. We speak about climate change. I think the UN climate processes is a fundamental display of the role that the UN plays in this regard. We spoke about farming, the early warning system, but also the food classification that determines which country is experiencing acute food insecurity and nutrition insecurity. In that regard, the normative standards that we take for granted because they are part of the background architecture that we are so accustomed to are all emanating from the United Nations. So in that regard, that's why I see the development of the UN in a multipolar world, in a polycrisis of the custodian of these normative standards. And there are no better places for that to be demonstrated apart from the African continent. We'll just use two examples that I have probably previously used on your show, Adnan. Like if you look at Sudan, South Sudan and Somalia, these are countries that are the ground zero of the impact of climate change. Go back and you'll see where farming has been declared in this century. South Sudan and Somalia features very closely, but a huge chunk of that is primarily driven by climate change. One part of South Sudan occasionally is submerged because of flooding, while the other part is experiencing food insecurity because of drought. But if you look at the contribution of either of these countries and many of the African countries, their contribution of greenhouse emission is almost negligible. It's still very, very small for a country, for a continent that is a significant chunk of the, the global population. But I think this is where the role of the UN becomes again very important, the question around equity. But what is very interesting is in this multipolar polycrisis situation, the people who are embracing the UN a lot, the people whose lives are impacted by the UN a lot, are the people who are embracing the UN, and that is, if you go into many parts of the African continent, that they see UN as a force of good. And the people who are anti the UN, despite the fact that sometimes they benefit disproportionately from it, especially the UN Security Council, are the people who are hammering the UN every single day at the UN General Assembly when the President of the United States said the UN is irrelevant. It issues a lot of strongly worded statements that have got no follow-up. Well, you know what? If the UN is enabled, it will be able to do well. But I think this calls for a different way of looking at the UN in our current context. But I think that requires leadership. That requires even people like ourselves to stand up for the UN for the places where it does good, and really tell where it goes wrong, that here are areas of improvement. There are no perfect institutions because we don't have perfect human beings.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to both of you for being with us. And that's all for this edition of our special UN series. Stay with us for more throughout the week. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.